Good morning. Can I welcome everybody to the 16th meeting in 2012 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to turn off their mobile phones and Blackberries as they do affect the broadcasting system. We've received apologies this morning from Jim Eadie and Adam Ingram, and Bob Doris is in attendance as a substitute. We begin the meeting today with our second evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft budget for 2013-14. The focus of this session will be on the allocation of spending for affordable housing. So I welcome the witnesses, who are today Philip Hogg, Chief Executive of Homes for Scotland, Kennedy Foster, CML Policy Consultant for Scotland Council of Mortgage Lenders, Jim Hayton, Policy Manager of Alacho, and Graham Harper, Policy Manager of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Can I thank you all for submitting your written evidence, and can I ask Margaret to start the questioning this morning, please?
Good morning, everybody. My first question, I've got two questions to ask. The Government's 5-year plan to develop 30,000 additional affordable homes, including 6,000 per year, resulted in 6,800 completions in year one. Why did the performance exceed the target, and what are your views about whether the target for the rest of the planning period can be met? Anybody, any offers?
First of all, I'd like to answer that. For year one of the year that you've referred to, there were a number of completions that were residual from the accelerated spending that the government brought forward in 2009-2010 to take advantage of lower land and construction and property prices. So what we were seeing is a lot of that coming through as completions in the last financial year. And secondly, a lot of residual projects that hadn't quite started but were able to. It was a one-off, and I think it's unlikely to be repeated.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with aspects of what Graham said. I think it's essentially a function of the programming that there happened to be that amount of houses programmed and able to start in that year, and that would account for it being slightly above the target. In respect of whether we're likely to meet those targets for the remaining period that you described, as I said in Alacho's evidence, we're not complacent about that, and of course there are no absolute guarantees, but we're reasonably optimistic that we should be able to do that, assuming of course that we do what we must do and pay attention to the programme year on year and make sure that, you know, we make adjustments as we go along to make sure that the targets indeed are met and possibly even exceeded if we're able to do that.
Thank you.
I think obviously a lot of the stuff that was coming through was probably at the higher grant levels as well, and we're now into a grant level which is nearer £40,000, so it'll be interesting to see what that brings forth.
I have nothing in addition to add to that.
And my other question is, if there's a shortfall, what should or could be done to alleviate any deficit in the affordable new supply?
Just to pick up on what Jim said, the amount of funding that the government has in place just now, which is some 760 million, in my view, would be sufficient to meet the target and more than meet the target, assuming that housing associations and local councils can continue to develop at the lower grant levels. And I think the jury has to be out on that just now. The feedback from our members is that we cannot do that indefinitely. We can do that in the short term. How long that short term is really up for discussion.
I think my response to that would be that if there is a shortfall, and I assume you mean a shortfall in completions rather than a shortfall in resources, because I think we'd probably agree that certainly resources as they stand are sufficient to meet the target. It's much more a question of making sure that we have sufficient houses programmed to start so that we meet the target. If it looked like that was going to be a shortfall, we'd have to pick that up as early as we possibly could. And from my perspective, representing local authority housing officers, I think, who have a big say now in the programme management, which we had previously asked for. We need to make sure that that message was communicated very speedily and timely fashion to local authorities to make sure that other schemes were pulled forward and any problems with delayed site starts and so forth, in as far as they possibly can be, compensated by other schemes coming forward. I do take on board the point that you know, that is not to say there could be issues with RSLs or housing associations being able to fund schemes, but I do see that as another issue that we need to keep a very close eye on and just make sure that we do whatever we can to attempt to deliver in these targets.
Thank you.
All I would add is I think one of the challenges will be leveraging in private finance to assist with this programme, because as far as the banking sector is concerned, the marketplace has changed considerably since 2007, 2008, and you know, we will have to be looking at more innovative ways of financing social housing going forward, and there is quite a lot of work going on in that regard at the moment.
Just to really add on to Kennedy's point, I think that if we look at the trajectory of housing output, it's in its entirety, public and social affordable housing, we're still unfortunately on a downward path. And I think that has to be a concern for all of us. And it will require innovative approaches to increasing housing output, innovative financial approaches. And we've seen, obviously, NHT as an example of one of them. It will not be the solution in itself. I think there will have to be other similar models, mixture of public and private finance, that will ensure that we increase housing output, both affordable and private housing.
Thank you.
Can you just expand a bit, Mr. Hogg, on the, you said it was on a downward path in provision of social rented housing. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, if we look at completions, housing completions for 2011, you'll find that it's the lowest overall number since 1947. And the indications that we have from our membership, I should just clarify that Homes for Scotland represents both private home builders and a good proportion of RSLs, housing associations, that have development new build capabilities. And the indications that we have from our membership is that output in 2012 is unlikely to be higher than it was in 2011. So the impact of the recession is still biting hard. So overall housing output is still at very, very low levels. That's private and affordable. And clearly that puts pressure on the whole system. So that's the reason why I'm sort of suggesting that there's still a downward trajectory, albeit maybe minor, but we're still pretty well running at the bottom.
Yes, so you're taking into account private housing,
yes,
in what you're saying. The 40 million that was announced in the increase in the budget goes some way to recover the cut of the previous year. And some of you've maybe answered this in saying that that will go quite a way to help to meet the target. But could you maybe, Mr. Foster, expand on what you were saying about alternative measures you would ask the government to consider in order to maybe exceed the target if you think it's going to be met?
I wasn't really calling on the government to come forward with alternative measures. I think what basically I was saying is, in terms of leveraging in private finance to assist with this programme, probably we have to look at more innovative ways in doing that. And I know the Scottish Government does have a team down in Victoria Quay who are looking at that at the moment, and I'm sure Graham will say some of the things that some of the RSLs are involved in. I have been on the board of an RSL who I know is looking at a way of financing which would be effectively an arrangement between a developer and an institutional investor, and effectively would lease the stock over a period of time and potentially buy it at the end of a 30-year period for a peppercorn sum. So there are things like that being looked at the moment, and as Philip alluded to, the likes of the National Housing Trust model has been recently extended into the RSL sector as well. And you know, there's other ways as well. down south. The bond and capital markets are used quite a lot by housing associations. It's a way of leveraging in finance as well. The one challenge you have in Scotland is that the RSLs aren't quite as big as they are down south of the border.
Is there a role for government in that, in perhaps being guarantor or?
I think there is potential of the use of guarantees, and I think you've seen the UK government announce that they're going to give guarantees for the social housing sector going forward.
Okay, Malcolm.
Just carrying on with that theme of financial capacity and I suppose alternative financial products which you've touched on. I mean, to some extent Graham's already dealt with this, but the target for new affordable supply is premised on independent research estimates of the long-term financial capacity of social landlords to deliver more affordable supply. 2 years on, what is your view? That's 2 years on, I suppose, from the Bramley review of this. What is your view of the financial capacity of the sector to deliver more affordable housing, and to what level?
As regards Professor Bramley's research, would first of all point out that there were some issues with the accuracy of the figures, but more importantly, we live in a very different world even from 2010. Bramley's research assumed, banked on the willingness of RSLs to use all of its resources and to use them for the provision of new affordable housing. There are many other calls in those reserves as well for things like major repairs, which they are actually there for. We have a new environmental and energy efficiency standard on the horizon to help address fuel poverty and carbon emissions. We have to fund adaptations ourselves as well. So there's an awful lot more calls on these reserves than simply building new houses. In 2010, benefit reform was in its infancy and wasn't particularly well understood by the report either. We are in a situation where land and build costs are artificially low, and there's a real risk of increase even from the building regulations in 2013 will increase build costs significantly. So but the major issue is one that Kennedy's touched on already, is the private finance climate. Banks don't seem to have the resources now to lend and the willingness to lend that they once did.
Are you saying that the new subsidy regime is dependent on the use of reserves, or are you saying?
Broadly speaking, yes. Associations would have to essentially use their own reserves to top up the 20 to 25k funding gap that we have.
And the housing association's reserves run down?
Exactly. We'll stop developing. And that's one of the major factors that's going to mean we can only develop at this level in the short term. There are other ways where associations can use surpluses to borrow extra funds, but again, like reserves, they can only be spent once, and once they're gone, they're gone. I do worry that we do irreparable damage to the housing association sector by continuing the policy of developing at 40,000 subsidy.
So you're saying financial capacity is an important constraint. I mean, are there any suggestions from the others about how we get around this? I mean, I don't know what extent, you know, mixing social rented, which is happening increasingly, obviously, with mid-market rent and so on, whether that helps, or some of the things that Kennedy Foster touched on in terms of other ways of accessing money through bonds or whatever.
It depends how it's funded.
Can we let some of the others come in?
Yeah, well, from a local authority, from a council perspective, it's slightly different. We were also covered by the conclusions of the Bramley report, and I think we were a bit more sanguine about the conclusions that he reached. I do apologise, there's a typographical error in my evidence, and I suggested that Bramley said that councils could build potentially 2,000 houses a year. I think it was actually 2,500 that he reckoned that we could build, taking into account a whole load of assumptions. Now, I did a wee bit of work to try and validate that about this time last year, and the conclusions I got back from a more cheap and cheerful survey were that, broadly speaking, councils did think that they had some capacity, and if government continued to provide subsidy at £30,000 a unit, they could perhaps get above the 1,000 units a year that we're expected to deliver at the moment, and maybe even get to the vicinity of 2,000 to 2,500. But, and the buts are in our written evidence, we do have to take account of the potential shocks to the system of welfare reform and the reduction of revenues. which clearly could inhibit councils' ability to borrow more and therefore to fund more, and we cannot even remotely afford to ignore the potential problems that RSLs might face, because of course together RSLs and councils are going to be delivering the social housing programme. So whilst councils are a different form of lending, we simply have to calculate whether we can afford to repay a particular loan, and we get that from Public Works Loan Board rather than having to go and make a specific case to private lenders. I think there's still a reasonable degree of optimism that councils have a wee bit of capacity to improve and increase their output a little, as long as we keep a very close eye on the possible constraints and the possible challenges that may come as we go forward.
So are you saying in the long run it may be easier for councils to build houses than for housing associations?
I think in the long run that is the case. If nothing else changes, if the subsidy regime stayed the same, then it's likely to be easier for councils to increase their output. Not necessarily, or maybe it's not even likely that we could completely replace the output of RSLs, but there's probably a scope for a bit more from councils if the kind of limited research that we've done to date is accurate.
So how does that work? Because you get a lower subsidy, but you can borrow more cheaply, but do they not cancel each other out? Have you not got the same problem about repaying loans and the rents going up to do that?
Councils tend to have a bit more latitude in the sense of generally having much larger housing stocks. Therefore, they're able to pool costs across a lot more houses in terms of the revenue accounts. Typically, an RSL, if it were building 50 houses, would need to fund those 50 houses from the revenue stream, the rents that came from those houses alone, whereas a council, like my old council, South Lanarkshire, with perhaps 25, 30,000 houses, building another 100 or 200 houses tends to be more marginal, doesn't have such a big impact in rents and so forth. So yeah, councils would, I think, generally find it a wee bit easier to generate the income and to build than RSLs.
I mean, I wonder if the other two could comment on any alternative models of affordable housing supply that the government should investigate, or modified models or whatever.
I would just add to what Graham said in terms of you can only raid reserves once. There is maybe some hope going forward that there could be some cross-subsidisation from the like of homes that you're building for mid-market rent. We're also seeing quite a strong move down south of the border because of the demand in the private rented sector at housing associations are becoming involved in the private rented sector. I don't think there's much evidence of that so far up here, Graham. And at one stage, housing associations, certainly down south, used to build a lot of housing either for shared equity or shared ownership, and some of that cross-subsidised into the social housing sector. I think there's other things. The UK government have looking at real estate investment trusts for social housing as well. They've got certain tax advantages, but that's not really got off the ground. And I think that's one of the challenges, getting some of these new models up and running.
I would reinforce Kennedy's point. I think that there is an understanding about the budgets are the budgets, and what we've got to do is be creative in how we use those. And I think there are some innovative financial solutions that are still at very early stages, still being discussed, still being explored. And I think that their time will come probably sooner than we may all appreciate in terms of having to drive them forward. Certainly as an organisation, there's no shortage of ideas being proposed to us as an industry, as a trade body. And we're looking to explore these. Indeed, that's one of the areas that will be a focus of our activity, to drive forward in terms of exploring new delivery models, new financial delivery models that cover across all ranges of tenure, because I think that the growing private rented sector in the middle, people who would traditionally have considered themselves to be wanting to purchase their own home, but for a variety of obvious reasons, deposits being the main one, are finding it difficult to purchase. They're then being pushed back into social rented. where clearly they wouldn't normally have been considering that form of tenure. So the growing middle area is one I think is of an opportunity for us, and we should see it as an opportunity to relieve the pressure on social rented stock. And I think this is the area where the industry, where traditionally may have been somewhat polarised, needs to work collaboratively to ensure that we have that mix of tenure, and it will involve, exploring these new financial solutions that are going to deliver that. And I see government guarantees as potentially playing a key role in all of that. And I'm aware that Westminster Government recently announced their desire to offer government guarantees for projects. And I think the Scottish Government has to pick up that baton and see how they can be used to unlock reserves and unlock cash into the system.
Just ask one last question. I mean, mid-market rent's been mentioned. I suppose two questions on that. I mean, would it be helpful if there were government guarantees for mid-market rent? But secondly, somebody mentioned cross-subsidy. I just wondered to what extent mid-market rent can cross-subsidise and whether that is in fact an option in many places in Scotland or just in a few places such as Edinburgh, where we certainly do need mid-market rent.
If I could come on that one. First of all, mid-market rent has the effect of lowering average subsidies for mixed development. So if you have a mid-market rent development and a social housing development, obviously the average subsidy is that little bit lower. But in terms of actually generating capital in the same way as housing associations who built for sale might have once been able to do, I'm not sure that that's really possible in the current economic climate. I do think we need to look at everything, look at partnership working. We work with Homes for Scotland's members as well, but the one note of caution is that these innovative models tend to look at just mid-market rent, and there is an affordability issue with mid-market rent for some people, particularly if there's housing benefit involved, and there's a very real risk that it could start to push up the housing benefit bill, which we wouldn't want to see.
I think most local authorities would concur that whilst mid-market rent is a useful tool in the toolbox for the reasons that you've just outlined, it's not going to work everywhere and maybe only in a minority of cases. But where it can make a contribution to the overall output of social housing, certainly worth exploring.
Okay.
Gordon, you want to ask some questions about land supply?
Yeah, and the evidence from Home from Scotland, you highlighted that Scottish planning policy requires planning authorities to ensure availability of a minimum of 5-year supply of effective housing land, and only 3 or 4 local authorities have a 5-year land supply. Given that in rural areas the majority of the land is owned by less than 1% of the population, and in urban areas we have supermarket land banking, is land supply a constraint on the delivery of the Scottish affordable supply target?
I think that's it's not easy to answer that question with a yes or a no, sadly. I think that the land market clearly goes through cycles of desirability based on risk and based on demand. And we're probably at the point in the cycle now where, well, for housing associations, and Graham will be able to speak probably more clearly, but land acquisition is probably as affordable as probably it ever has been because there's less competition. Certainly private developers are not actively pursuing land in volume. They're only looking to purchase land where there's some confidence that it's good land and there's demand for it, demand for where people want to live. So that's taken some of the pressure off the land. In terms of is it a constraint, I'm not hearing at the moment from feedback from our members that land is the big constraint. That's not to say that progressing it through the planning system isn't still a burden and isn't still a task. And certainly that there is need to ensure that when land is available, that it's progressed through the planning system as efficiently and effectively as possible. But in terms of availability, I'm not hearing that is the major constraint at the moment.
I would certainly echo Philip's comments on the planning system. And like Philip, I'm not aware of any real constraint that the land supply is having on housing development at any kind of tenure. What I would say is there's a couple of local authority areas where there's a that have high property prices and high private rents, where land supply could be a little bit of a problem. And in the Highlands, and particularly in rural areas, the land tends to come with quite high infrastructure costs. But again, there's no real national issue with that.
If I could just add one more point on there, is that I mentioned about the cycle of land. If and when, and we all hope, if that things start to improve, clearly there is a time lag from when land is required and when land is needed to when it's actually available, and we have to ensure that we plan for when that upturn comes, and that the land market and the planning system doesn't act as a constraint on delivery when the market is ready for delivery. So that is an important point. It's not an issue at the moment, but when it does become needed, we need to ensure that local authorities do have the sufficient land available in the right places, and it's capable of progressing forward.
Yeah, I think we would tend to agree with that we must be ready for the upturn when it comes, but that at the moment I don't think land supply is a constraint, a significant constraint on the programme. Much more to do with the macroeconomic system and a situation rather than the problems that's having, and the problems with people getting deposits for mortgages at the bottom end of the market in particular.
So given that there isn't a constraint on land supply, and most people seem to agree to that, should there be a restriction on developers trying to build on greenbelt sites, especially where there are brownbelt sites, brownfield sites nearby that have previously had housing and have lain empty for many years?
I think that if you're talking of private developers and land, you have to understand that a private developer is only going to speculate on building homes if they have confidence that there is a market there to sell them, or someone to purchase them that has the desire and the capability of purchasing the homes once they're built. And any land that is seen as risky or peripheral or is not prime, at the moment a developer wouldn't take a risk on that land. So that's the reason why some land may seem to be available, but it's not necessarily a case of whether it's available, it's whether it's attractive and desirable, I think, are the key things to bear in mind. Otherwise, developers will look for land that is, again, they need confidence that that land can be sold through, those homes will be sold, and not just be sitting as stock.
Insofar as it's mainly a question about planning policy, of course, but insofar as it relates to housing policy, I think most local authority chief housing officers would probably agree with the premise, given that the premise that we should look first at brownfield sites, given that most local authorities and RSLs will still be very keen in regeneration and making sure that those parts of our communities which have perhaps become a bit run down and clearly need of regeneration should get some degree of priority. So I don't think many would disagree with the statement.
I think that it's difficult to generalise. I think in places like Glasgow, when there is an awful lot of brownfield land around, it would be difficult to make an argument to build on the green belt there, such as there is one. In Edinburgh, it might be slightly different. We would need to make sure we're building the right homes in the right locations, and typically these are ones that are near local services and part of communities, so that would probably suggest that building on the green belt for social housing is probably unlikely, but it really just depends on the location.
You talked, Gordon, about supermarkets banking land, developers bank land as well. Are we seeing some of that bank land by developers being released for social rented housing, whereas before they might have wanted to build luxury 4 and 5 bedroom houses for private sale?
The same arguments apply. I mean, the biggest constraint for developers at the moment is cash, is working capital. It's the same common denominator that affects us all, and they can't afford, nor do not want to afford, to have land sitting on their balance sheets. They want to develop it and turn that cash and turn those homes and make some profits. But again, the argument applies that they're not going to develop unless they're confident that they can sell through, confident that there's a market for the homes. And of course, when they do develop their homes, Quite often, more often than not, there's a Section 75 requirement for an affordable proportion of social housing that accompanies the private development, so that the benefits flow through in that case.
I think the land supply is such that RSLs have a great deal of choice, which they wouldn't have had 4 or 5 years ago pre-credit crunch. And I think it's probably unlikely that we would be able to meet the seller's expectations in those situations. Obviously, private developers would pay a fair bit more for land than we would. But just to pick up on the Section 75s, we are hearing that in sort of isolated pockets there are issues where developers are unable to progress with private sites, therefore that's stalling the Section 75 contributions too. I think Section 75 sites are going to be more and more important if subsidy rates remain as low as they are. So it's very important that we hold on to that.
I think that's an important point, Graham, and I think that what we have is evidence of a number of sites that are stalled or are not progressing because the original the land was purchased or the deal was concluded at a time when market conditions were a lot different. And the Section 75 now agreements that were maybe entered into are unrealistic or undeliverable, so we have a net result of nothing happening. And I think if there was opportunity to renegotiate or review some of these Section 75 requirements, the net result would be we'd have more homes across all tenures. And I think that's the area that we maybe need to explore to try and get some development happening and releasing homes across the board.
How would there be more homes of all tenures if you took away the Section 75?
No, I didn't say take it away. I said is to review the way the Section 75 agreement has been arranged, is the proportions and maybe what's involved in the Section 75 agreement. Because at the moment, if the site is stalled, then it's no good to anyone. But if it could be progressed and maybe the deal were reviewed, then there could be output across the board.
Sorry, Chair, were you?
No, I'm saying, do the rest of you agree with that?
Section 75s, of course, are an attempt to try and capture some of the value inherent in land and make sure that at least a portion of that gets directed to social housing. And there's widespread agreement in that, and I know from Philip's organisation too. In my view, local authorities wouldn't be dogmatic about that. If private developers had proposals that they wanted to talk about, everyone would accept that we're now stuck in a bad situation with the current economic climate. And I would hope that most local authorities would at least want to speak about that, even if that meant having to accept a bit less than they had originally envisaged or planned for. I would hope that most of my colleagues in local authorities would at least be up for discussion on that. They want to see the parameters, of course. They want to see what the outputs would be. But I think Alachua would certainly welcome those kind of discussions taking place. And I'd be surprised if in many authorities that kind of dialogue wasn't actually happening at the moment. And I would certainly hope it was.
I would echo what Jim's just said. Generally, the SFHA want to see more homes built across all tenures, particularly if there's a Section 75 contribution that can come along with that. And in the same way as local authorities, housing associations are well up for those discussions too, and I'm sure they're happening already.
Graham, you mentioned earlier about costs of building, and clearly we're in a situation at the moment where there's not much happening in the private sector and builders want to keep their firms going. So are costs generally still in the downward trend or static or moving slightly upward, or where are we with that?
I think it's fair to say costs are probably bumping along the bottom. Contractors, and this is anecdotal, appear to be swallowing the cost of rising material costs. So I think we're certainly at the bottom of the curve. I would reiterate what I said, that once things start to pick up, and hopefully they will soon, then these costs will start to rise. But also the building regulation changes in 2013 and 2016 will have quite a dramatic effect on that too.
Okay, Alex?
Thanks very much. A couple of the witnesses have already touched on the issue of housing benefit changes, and I wanted to go into that in slightly more detail and invite you to consider the housing benefit changes in the way it's calculated and the way it's going to be paid, and how that might impact on affordable housing supply targets.
Start from a local authority perspective. Local authorities at the moment are all considering these very questions and coming up with what you might term strategies and mitigation to try and preempt some of the changes and make sure that we understand the implications, both for local authority, council housing revenues, and more importantly, I guess, on the kind of impact in the lives of the people concerned. But the key link between the potential impact of the reforms and new supply, of course, is if it damages council revenues and they are reduced significantly from what we forecast, then we won't be able to service the increased borrowing that we naturally have to take out to build new homes. So I guess that is the straightforward answer to the question, that the biggest impact will be in revenues. There are changes proposed, direct payments, for example, to tenants, which many people expect may result in less income being collected by councils and RSLs, more rent arrears. There are other changes which are less about revenues and more about issues for housing allocation policies. But in terms of the links between the welfare reforms and the supply, the definite threat, I think, is the potential reduction in revenues inhibiting that, meaning, of course, that money is not available then to service loans that might otherwise have gone to build new houses.
The SFHA commissioned some research recently on the impact of benefit reform, and while it's very difficult to predict this with any degree of certainty, the kind of middle ground and the assumptions are we could be facing a 5% hit in terms of increased cost and reduced turnover. The extra effort that will have to go into collecting rent is almost as much as the projected loss through the direct payments issue. The lenders will obviously have a view on that as well, and again, that's going to contribute to higher margins, higher risk for lenders and things, and I'm sure Kennedy could fill us in further on that.
Yeah, obviously we've been watching very closely the issues around the welfare reform agenda, and we have joined with the likes of SFHA and their sister organisation, the National Housing Federation, in expressing some concerns, particularly around the direct payment to the tenant. What impact this will have on RSLs, it's very difficult to say, but obviously when there was a direct payment pilot done in the private rented sector a number of years ago, it did result in arrears to landlords increasing. Obviously there are pilot projects going on at the moment, and we're hopeful that lessons will be learnt from these. The issue for lenders will be that if it causes RSL levels of arrears to increase, that probably doesn't only have an impact as far as borrowing for new developments concerned, it probably impacts on existing borrowing arrangements which RSLs have. And in Scotland, lenders have some £3 billion invested in the RSL sector in Scotland, and it could potentially impact on the likes of financial covenants. And Graham's absolutely right, it does potentially increase the risk profile of the RSL sector, which is always, as far as lenders are concerned, been a good risk profile. So it's very much a wait and see at the moment what the impact is. We're hopeful that some lessons will be drawn from the pilots which are currently being conducted, and obviously Dunedin and Canmore are participating up here in Scotland.
We've already heard that some of your organisations, local authorities in particular, are developing a strategy to deal with these problems. But is there anything you feel that could be done at a Scottish Government level that might assist you in achieving that? You know, are there things that we could be doing here that would lessen the impact that you fear?
Absolutely. The People and Communities Fund, which is the new replacement for wider role funding, in the past has funded schemes such as a tenancy sustainment programme where housing associations and local authorities can get and engage with tenants who are experiencing difficulties. It can ultimately prevent evictions. There are huge savings to the public purse, not to mention the benefits for the tenants themselves. We find it ironic that given the welfare reform that's going on just now, that the People and Communities Fund isn't taking applications for tenancy sustainment funds. And that's one thing that the Scottish Government could do, which would assist greatly in preparing for benefit reform.
Any other ideas?
Obviously, there's limited capacity, I guess, because significant powers are reserved to Westminster. But we're about, I mean, we work, Alacho and indeed SFHA work closely with Scottish Government because in a lot of ways our interests are absolutely the same in this one and trying to mitigate the impacts. We're about to undertake a kind of review of local authority state of readiness, so to speak, for welfare reform, and I think emerging from that, we would be looking to speak very closely with government about where the latitude is and where there may be some powers to do the kind of things that Graham's just talked about. Having regard to the point I made at the start, which is, there are clearly some constraints in that because of, powers which are reserved to Westminster.
Nothing from me.
Well, if you come up with anything, you'd let us know. Yeah. Thanks very much.
I just get some further information. Aren't evictions and things going down anyway, and the Tenancy Sustainment Fund work is being done by housing associations and councils anyway because of the vast costs of evictions, and it's more important to help people generally sort out their lives and avoid eviction.
Absolutely. 2 years ago, RSL evictions went down by 38%, and there was a further 19% drop this year. So you're absolutely right that evictions are going down. We see evictions very much as a last resort and almost as a failure of the system. The amount of money involved in things like tenancy sustainment schemes is relatively small. Housing associations and local authorities are doing what they can. There's some very good partnerships going on to protect tenancies and make those savings. We've got a figure here that says for every £1 invested in a tenancy sustainment scheme, there's a £2.62 return to the sector in there. So it's certainly money well spent. We're not talking huge amounts of money to do this, but it's something that really will mitigate the impact of benefit reform.
Yeah, I would agree with the kind of sentiment in the question as well. The emphasis on local authorities in the last few years has moved much more towards prevention. And of course, eviction ultimately is absolutely no one's interest because it's just acknowledging that a problem hasn't really been solved. It's just been shifted somewhere, particularly where there are families involved, which is becoming, fortunately, rarer and rarer. But we have seen as a consequence of this focus on prevention through the kind of advice and information and hubs approach, a significant reduction in homeless applications in local authorities. We've seen councils, 2 individual councils, and questions about what the Scottish Government could do. But councils themselves are trying to do things which are helpful to individuals. Some councils I'm aware of doing kind of income maximisation checks for every new tenant. One council just reporting recently £4 million being generated in that manner for tenants. So we're doing what we can, I think, to mitigate this and putting the focus very much in preventing things like evictions, which just result in a problem for someone else to deal with. Quite frequently the same local authority, of course, who will have to deal with that household in some other office through the kind of homelessness route. And the more we can stop that happening, the better, of course.
Move on, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. This year we'll move to multi-year resource planning assumptions, with local authorities taking much more of the lead in the development funding process across Scotland, with an attempt to marry spend to local need. Understand 80% of that resource will be directed from a local level. In the 3-year assumptions, there's also a hope that next year indicative figures for 2015-16 will also be issued to keep that 3-year rolling plan on target. Can I ask you for some brief comments in relation to that plan in general, but what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of that process and that practice?
Well, local authorities have been talking to Scottish Government for a wee while now about the new system, and given that we had specifically asked for 3-year resource planning assumptions, a move away from the kind of bids and challenge funding, which are very kind of resource intensive and not particularly productive. We asked for 3-year resource planning assumptions. We asked for integrated programmes to be developed by local authorities, i.e. council and RSL projects going together in some kind of coherent plan. And we got that. And we asked for a degree of more influence and latitude for local authorities on the planning of that. It's not absolute because Scottish Government still retain the ultimate control over that. Now, having had productive conversations in that and kind of getting what we asked for, it would be a bit churlish now to say that we didn't agree with it. We do agree with it. We think it's the right place for these decisions to be made at local authority level through the medium of the local housing strategy and the strategic local programmes, which effectively document the nuts and bolts of the housing projects that are to be delivered. Having said that, we understand that with that comes a significant degree of responsibility to make sure that these programmes get delivered and the targets that we talked about earlier get achieved. And our view in that would be that we work very closely with Scottish Government in particular to monitor outputs and expenditure. We work at local level with RSL partners to make sure that local programmes are being delivered. So to sum up, I think it's absolutely the right thing to do to give us a 3-year planning horizon. It must be augmented, of course, as we go along so that we don't kind of fall off a cliff at the end of the 3 years and we get good advance warning of what resources are likely to be for the year or two out with the 3-year programme at an appropriate point in that cycle. But we're confident in local authorities that it's the right thing to do, that the locus of responsibility is in the right place, and we'll be doing everything that we can to make sure that the new system's a success.
I would echo every single word that Jim said. The 3-year programme that we have has made a significant difference to our ability to plan for the longer term, and also the fact that it recognises the local authorities' strategic role in the whole process. Just pick up that the 15-16 figures are very important. We recognise there's a spending review to take place before that, but if we can get to a rolling programme of a 3-year commitment, it allows us to effectively plan ahead and really get the most value out of the money that we have.
It's not my area of expertise, but I would echo what's being said in terms of the 3-year programme and also the involvement of local authorities in terms of the likes of the local housing strategy. But I think it's very early days in this new arrangement, and I think the jury is still out to see how it works.
Could I perhaps ask a couple of questions in relation to that? There may be indicative figures published next year following a spending review, but the money that comes to this Parliament, of course, can change quite dramatically based on decisions from another place. Does that lead to uncertainty, despite the fact we'll have a 3-year rolling programme when the figures can only ever be indicative because of the funding position of this Parliament? And also, in another existence, I was Deputy Chair of a local government committee where we talk about concordats and single outcome agreements. Now, I know that local housing strategies have to be signed off at a national level, but is there a tension there to make sure that there's national housing strategies and priorities are filtered through in a constructive way and in partnership at a local level? Are conversations positive, constructive in relation to that, or do you see any potential issues there?
There's two things to come back on. First of all, in terms of the spending and budget figures going forward, we recognise that the 3-year programme in some cases can be little more than a planning assumption, but we essentially have been able in the past to progress things on that basis, on that there's some degree of certainty that things are going to come through. There's always a risk, but we have that certainty. I don't detect any tensions in terms of national and regional priorities as yet, but it might be too early to say. Jim probably knows a bit more about that than I do.
I mean, in terms of the premise of the question, I absolutely agree that what's vital is that the channels of communication are absolutely clear and open between local government and national government. And I would agree with Graham that I think relationships are good there. I think you're also absolutely right to say that we need to, in a sense, preempt whatever happens, even though we don't quite know what that's likely to be. And a lot of that will be down to good programme planning arrangements at local authority level with their partners, such that whatever happens in a spending review, good news or bad, particularly if it's good news and there's extra money available, that we have the projects ready to take advantage of that. I take your point that sometimes things happen relatively quickly and out of a blue sky, and we're asked to spend money relatively quickly. And I think it's vital that we have that range of projects available and ready to go to take advantage of that kind of money if it does become available. Similarly, if there's a downside and you know, money's going the other way, the earlier notice that we can get about that from national government, the better we'll be able to start factoring that in and speaking to people about programmes. Because you know, housing associations and local authorities and private contractors have jobs depending on this. So the better information we can give about likely availability of resources and the earlier that we can do that, the better.
Point very well made. And the final question I have in terms of the general resource allocation that goes to local authorities and their budget settlement from the Scottish Government, do you see any relationship between the funding that you'll be directing at a local level and the wider budget and interaction between them? Will there be trade-offs at any point within the budget lines?
Sorry, could you maybe just repeat that so I'm sure I'm understanding that one?
Well, the suggestion's been made that local government will have a budget settlement given each year from Scottish Government, where they'll make investment plans and there'll be capital and the resource allocation there. And separate from that, you've got the very specific allocation for planning assumptions around housing. Will there be an interaction between those two budgets, and will there be a trade-off in priorities and how that money is spent?
I'm sure it's one that I'm in a position to answer just yet. I mean, will there be an interaction? There certainly should be, insofar as they both affect housing. I think I would want to understand a wee bit better just the kind of implications of that. And, you know, my intuitive answer to what you're saying is there will always be trade-offs, and, you know, it's up to us to be speaking to, as housing professionals, if you like, to be advising local politicians and what the potential trade-offs are, and for them to give us advice and direction of what the priorities might be.
There's been much comment about the future shape of the RSL sector and how the current economic situation has seen an apparent shift in the geography and the nature of providers developing in the RSL sector. Is it an inevitability that we'll move to more of structure of larger developing associations, or is there still room for the community-based sector developing locally?
I think that's difficult to give a general answer to. Certainly the number of developing associations is reducing. There's absolutely no question about that. I think there certainly remains considerable doubt as to whether the RSL network might cover the whole country going forward. The part of the question related to a smaller number of larger developers, that's something that first appeared in, I think, Firm Foundations, which is a policy document from about 2007, which was pre-credit crunch, where the view was that larger associations could perhaps do things cheaper and generate economies of scale. While that might well have been true in the past, I think it's fair to say now that the larger developers will ultimately be weaker if the subsidy targets stay at the same level. So it's quite an interesting turnaround there, but certainly I don't see the pattern that was envisaged in firm foundations taking place. I don't see a smaller number of larger developers and larger, stronger associations doing the development.
From a local authority perspective, again, I think many councils would discern that pattern, that there are some smaller housing associations saying that they won't be developing in future or can't do it at the current grant rates, leaving a smaller number of larger players in the field. But my personal view is that that would not necessarily be a bad thing if it could generate the kind of two benefits that we'd be looking for. One would be for the larger associations to maybe get procurement advantages and economies of scale by virtue of the fact that they are larger, maybe negotiating better loan deals. But if we could twin that with the advantages that we all perceive from smaller, locally based, often community-based housing associations, so wouldn't it be possible that perhaps we had larger associations developing, but the smaller associations with the community-based tenants on management committees and so forth doing the local management and getting the two benefits there? So I don't see it as universally a bad thing if it's managed correctly, and those kind of relationships can be forged in the future.
I've got three questions about housing need, and I'll roll up the first two together. Firstly, about the spatial distribution of housing need. Does the spatial distribution of housing need match up with the spatial distribution of money? And secondly, looking at it from a different perspective, is the target of 4,000 social rented and 5,000 of those, 4,000 a year that is, and 5,000 of those over the period being in the council sector, is that breakdown of different types of affordable housing also consistent with housing need as a whole across Scotland? So it's two aspects of housing need rolled up in one, if that's okay.
Your first question, I think, was about the geographical distribution of housing need and whether that is correlated with where the money gets spent. I think the answer to that has to be, as we've set out in the paper, probably not. I mean, the way that resources have been allocated historically in Scotland for affordable housing have tended to be just a bit of a function of historical accident, in terms of some baseline in the dim and distant past simply being added to year on year. Work is ongoing at the moment, though, to try and put the distributional basis onto a kind of more transparent, needs-based footing, and I'll actually have been involved with SFHA and others, including are led by the Scottish Government, to try and come up, and COSLA, to try and come up with just such a formula. And it's at a fairly advanced stage now for discussions between the relevant people at COSLA and Scottish Government, and hopefully that would result in the resources more accurately following patterns of need, not just geographical need, but other forms of need, like the instance of homelessness or affordability and so forth. By definition, there will be winners and losers out of that process potentially, but ultimately that whether they're accepted or not will be a matter for political judgment. Whether the current pattern in terms of specifically the social housing targets, the 4,000 and the 5,000 over the period of council housing, is directly focused in need, is another question, of course, and we've said in our evidence that it probably doesn't come close to meeting absolute need. And there are various measures of that, people on waiting lists, the work that's done by for local housing strategies and getting more into the fine grain of looking at housing needs and demand analysis. But I think everyone would agree that absolute needs would be significantly more than the 4,000 social houses a year would actually suggest. But that would take, to meet that, would take obviously significant injections of capital, particularly subsidy, which just aren't around at the moment. So we try to focus it as best we can, and we do that through local housing strategies, which is exactly where that kind of pattern of need is married up with resources, and we try to target those resources at the priorities that local authorities have, which will either be in regeneration areas, as we mentioned earlier, or in the provision of new supply where there's an absolute shortage of affordable housing.
I wanted to follow up on that point. You define need in a range of ways. I'm glad to hear that there's a discussion or a consideration about how need should be defined. But do you see at all the need to look at issues like, for example, labour mobility and how we define need? Because after all, Scotland has some of the highest and some of the lowest unemployment areas in the whole of the United Kingdom, but we don't get labour mobility, and that's the chief reason for that is lack of affordable housing, in my opinion. Do you think that's an area we need to consider as part of need?
Yeah, I think labour mobility and the need for people to move either to take up work or in search of work should certainly be a factor in consideration of where we should be investing in affordable housing. Clearly there needs to be some aspect to that which is about supporting the economy and trying to even kickstart the economy as best we can in the current circumstances. I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, I'd agree with Jim, and just to bring in one of the themes from the previous question about the split of social rent and mid-market rent, I think the 2/3, 1/3 might well be reasonable, but I'm not aware of any specific work that's been done to determine what the need for mid-market rent and other products is across the country. But one thing I'm certain of is it will be different. And in areas such as Aberdeenshire or Edinburgh, there is a bigger need for mid-market rent, and it might well be related to that there's if that's where the jobs are, that's perhaps where the mid-market rent could go for those that are economically active.
Another aspect of need, the final one I want to focus on is, of course, homelessness. I mean, I suppose that's an absolute need, but it's also a legal requirement, and I wonder to what extent the current levels of affordable housing supply will allow that objective to be met, which of course is supposed to be something that has happened by the end of, well, in a few months, 3 months' time.
Yeah, the 2012 target, of course, whereby local authorities are obliged to try and find accommodation for everyone who's homeless. Every new house is to be welcome, but the new supply is such a small proportion of the overall housing stock that it's going to be helpful, but by no means the absolute solution. And not the solutions to homelessness, but the ways we can tackle it most effectively are almost certainly likely to be around looking at more innovative ways of using our existing stock and putting a lot of resources and effort into preventing it happening in the first place. So I would never, gainsay the importance of new housing development as part of the problem in tackling homelessness. And ultimately, we just don't have enough houses, and clearly we do need to increase the supply. But in the short to medium term, I think our efforts are going to continue to be focused in making the best use of the stock that we already have. We have an estimate of, 23,000 empty houses in Scotland, trying to bring some of these back into use, trying to be a bit more creative in the way that we use allocation policies perhaps, and generating more than one move from a single housing allocation to find other ways, additional ways of increasing the supply, additional that is to building new housing.
I would echo what Jim said. Certainly prevention is the biggest weapon that we have against homelessness. The new house building supply is really is incredibly small compared with the need. Our figures are that there are 335,000 people on waiting lists at the moment, and we're building something like 6,000 a year. So clearly there's a huge amount to be done, but we recognise that the resources clearly aren't there to meet that.
Okay, anyone else got any questions? Bob, final one?
Yes, partially an apology because I muttered something under my breath during Mr Johnson's supplementary question, which I apologise for doing. I quite agree with his assumption that you have to encourage labour mobility to areas where there's particularly economic pressures, and that Aberdeen was mentioned. But in terms of planning assumptions and the wider housing strategy, would you agree that you also have to put wider economic strategy around that and actually develop jobs in areas where there's long-standing communities? So it's not just a matter of moving people and communities to where the economy is currently performing well, but an integrated housing and economic strategy would be to develop the economy in areas where perhaps there's stagnation and it's not developed for some time. Just for completeness, because I wouldn't want you to get the impression that the committee believes you should move traditional long-standing communities to areas of economic activity and desert those communities about that integrated planning framework that is economic and social in nature.
Absolutely. Housing certainly can't do that on its own, but where it's linked with regeneration, particularly in economic regeneration and creation of jobs, then there definitely needs to be a correlation there. One of the indicators that were used in the new strategic housing investment framework, which allocates resources, is that of deprivation and the index of multiple deprivation. So we would hope that that mechanism would make sure that disadvantaged communities continue to receive those benefits and that economic stimulus.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that either. I probably took the question more as being, a bit about the need for alternative forms of provision as well at different levels of rent and so forth. But I would agree with your premise of your question as well, that we need to support economic activity in areas where there's not enough of that at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Can I thank you very much, gentlemen, for the evidence that you have given today. Can I briefly suspend this meeting to allow the witnesses to leave the room and the new ones to take their seats? Right, just go. Right, if we can resume and move to agenda item 2, which is the Water Resources Scotland Bill. We will now hear further evidence on this bill at stage 1 from energy and environmental organisations. And can I welcome David Crockall, Environmental Specialist Advisor from SSE, Andy Limbrick, Environment Consultant Energy UK, and Stephen Freeland, Policy Executive from Scottish Environmental Services Association. Can I thank you all for submitting the written evidence and basing our questions on that and other things. Can I first of all ask what your view is on the adequacy of the consultation that took place prior to the introduction of the bill? And are you satisfied with the Scottish Government's response to any concerns that you raised during the consultation phase?
I thought the level of consultation was very good. We were pleased with the opportunity to submit evidence, and the summary of the consultation responses was good. I think the one point we would raise is that we now have a part of the bill, part 2 of the bill on water abstraction, which appears to have come in out of the blue, didn't appear to have been covered in the previous consultation. And that's an area that is of some concern to us, and we'll pick up on that later on.
Yeah, we'll come to specific questions on that.
Yeah, I thought the initial consultation, there were 2 consultation documents which were provided a good opportunity to feedback or comments on, and that the bill broadly reflected what we were expecting to come.
I would just echo what had been said. I think we were generally pleased with the 2 rounds of consultation, and we did feedback, and I think there were some small changes in the wording of the draft bill which reflected some of the concerns that we'd raised. The main outstanding issue is obviously, well, one of these is part 2 of the bill, which wasn't part of that, either of those 2 rounds of consultation.
Okay. Scottish and Southern Energy, you highlighted the development of inset water infrastructure in England and asks that the bill be amended to allow for competition for the provision of this type of service to be allowed in Scotland. Can you maybe explain what inset infrastructure is and why you think competition for the provision of such infrastructure and related services should be allowed in Scotland?
SSE, we have a small but fairly active part of the business, primarily active in England and Wales at the moment, where we can go along to a developer who's looking at a housing estate or a business park, some green or brownfield development site, and offer them utility services. So we provide electricity, gas and water to your development, and the pipe and infrastructure on the site, we can deal with that for them. And some developers find that quite an attractive option, that someone will come along and deal with all the services and utilities. I think we recognise it wasn't a key part of the consultation at the moment, but it was really just raising a flag and saying, you know, if that was possible in future, or in this bill or in a future bill, obviously we, you know, as a commercial organisation, we would be very keen to be involved in a market across the UK rather than just in England and Wales.
And what do you think would be the benefits of that for the Scottish economy and consumers and customers?
I mean, I think it's a service that is we offer to developers. So it would be down to the developer whether they wanted to deal with that themselves or whether they saw advantage to them in having someone that would come along and take that off their hands and deal with that for them. So it's really in terms of let's say small scale, well, generally small scale housing or business park developments. it's not an area I'm actually that expert in myself, but if the committee wanted more evidence, I'm sure colleagues would be more than happy to write to the committee on that basis. But it's really just saying, obviously that part of the business that is involved in England and Wales would like to deal across the UK, but we recognise it's not a key feature of the current bill.
Do either of the others have any comments on that part? No? Okay. So how do you think the bill might be amended to take account of the legislative developments currently underway in England and Wales with regard to the opening of the non-domestic water and sewerage market competition?
I have to say, again, it's not an area I'm expert in, but again, I could ask colleagues to write to the committee if they thought that would be helpful.
Okay, if you could do
I think that bill's still at a draft stage, but there may be things that could be read across. I don't know.
Okay, that would be helpful. Margaret.
Good morning. One of the main concerns raised in evidence from SSC and SCSA suggests that the bill could have a negative impact on private sector energy providers because it encourages Scottish Water to invest in areas such as the generation of renewable energy and waste management. What impact might the proposal in the bill have on companies operating in markets that are targeted by Scottish Water, such as the non-core function, for example, renewable energy generation and waste disposal?
Yeah, this was one of our key concerns in the bill, and given the context that the Scottish Government has just published their zero waste plan and the supporting regulations that come along with that, there's a clear drive for development of infrastructure for treating organic waste, whether it be food waste from domestic properties or organic waste from industrial and commercial premises. Having a body such as Scottish Water entering this market, which is publicly funded, has the potential to distort the market. The Scottish Water would have a number of advantages over a CISA member, for example, being able to use existing assets, sewage treatment works, which might now be redundant, would then mean that they've got access to the large land banks, whereas a private sector company would then have to go through acquiring land, raising the costs and such like. And that would then filter down to the charge that they're then able to offer to customers. And the concern is that that would be because they don't have the upfront costs and the same sort of financial constraints on them that a private sector would have. They would then be able to offer their service at a lower, below the market rate, which would be very uncompetitive as far as our members are concerned, who are also competing for the same feedstock.
Anybody else?
So I would echo that. I think there are two issues. One of which is I mean, I think we generally support anyone in developing renewable energy and using their existing assets in a way which maximises the value and the benefit of those. I think it's really just a question of how that's funded and whether any preferential treatment is given to any operator, whether it be Scottish Water or anybody else, in what is an open and competitive market, although it's regulated quite heavily, it is an open and competitive market. And it's just looking for a level playing field. Sorry, there's one other thing. The other thing I think is some of the discretionary powers given to Mrs. Antor Scottish Water talk about Scotland's water resources, which is defined as all inland waters, wetlands, and estuaries, not just those which Scottish Water have assets relative to or current abstractions from. And so it's really just a question of, does that affect existing water users? Does that affect existing water rights users? If Scottish Water saw an opportunity, would these powers give them the opportunity to go in and short-circuit legislative requirements that other people would have to comply with? I'm sure that I'm not suggesting that's the intention, but the way it's worded on some of the clauses suggests that they would have a lot of discretion in that area for all of Scotland's water resources, not just the ones that they currently have rights in relation to.
I'd echo what the previous two speakers have said about market conditions. We have a highly competitive GB market in electricity, and we're certainly be looking for a level playing field for companies of all shapes and sizes to participate in that.
Thank you. And my next question is, how do you respond to the assurance from the Scottish Government Build team that it is Minister's expectation that Scottish Water will engage in those non-core activities on properly commercial terms?
We have no objections to Scottish Water entering the market, as long as it was done on a level playing field. We haven't seen any assurances in the bill, to alleviate these concerns. So we would be looking for evidence of transparency, some evidence of what commercial returns have been made on public sector investment.
I would agree. I mean, I think I obviously welcome that commitment, but the words in the bill do matter. Obviously, that's what stays long term, and how that's interpreted and how that's applied can change over time. So I think if that's the commitment, then it would be nice to see that clearly defined on the face of the bill.
Okay, thank you.
I suppose the question does arise who has the responsibility to review those conditions?
Okay. Malcolm.
I've got a couple of questions to Scottish and Southern about their evidence. The first one you may have touched on to some extent already. Firstly, can you explain why you think Scottish Water status as a designated body that can be directed by Scottish ministers may give it an unfair competitive advantage in undertaking non-core duties? And secondly, you ask that the ministerial directions should be subject to public consultation prior to being issued, and I wonder why you think that would be beneficial.
Sorry, on the first part, I think it's, if you look, I think in part 3 of the bill, Scottish Water proposed to get a right to do anything that they think is necessary. Power to do anything Scottish Water considers will assist in the development and value of Scotland's water resources. And again, the way the water resources is defined is that's all inland, wetland and estuary waters, not just ones that they currently have access to. So, I mean, what does that mean? You can interpret that statement in different ways, but it's clearly quite a broad discretionary power. And whether it would have an impact or not depends on how it was interpreted and how it was applied. Sorry, I didn't catch the second.
The issue of ministerial directions, you're saying there should be consultation on those, and you're also saying that would give them an unfair advantage.
Well, again, in terms of the bill, ministers can have the power to ensure the development of the value of Scotland's water resources, which is the same definition of water resources. It's not just Scottish Water's existing assets or areas where they already have water rights. It could be a direction for water resource anywhere. So again, whether that's an issue or not, it depends on what directions are given. I mean, there's lots of pieces of legislation where ministers give directions to public bodies, and we haven't really seen an issue with any of them. But it's just the way some of these, it's the breadth of some of these powers and how far that will be applied and how that can be interpreted. It's just really whether the wording in the draft as it stands is as tight and well defined as it could be, so that people can really understand what the scope of what those directions could be. And if the directions, for example, in future would affect a third party, then it would be nice to think that those directions would be subject to consultation and discussion with third parties who may have existing water rights in those areas.
Right, so you're thinking specific consultation with interested or relevant people rather than a general public consultation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, and to everyone, the committee has heard calls that Scottish ministers should be required to consider social and environmental matters rather than just having an economic focus when developing the value of Scotland's water resources. What would your view be on that suggestion?
From our perspective, I think abstraction control and a lot of these issues are dealt with already under planning and under CAR, which should pick up most, if not all, of the social and economic issues. I think SEPA have gone on record as saying they're satisfied that CAR deals with all the environmental issues. So I think we would want to avoid any duplication or potential confusion of regimes cutting across each other and consents under one regime saying something slightly different than a consenter under another regime. So from our perspective, I think if there are areas which CAR and planning don't fully cover, which ministers feel they need additional powers on, it would be better for any new regime just to deal with those specific areas and not, not to encourage any duplication or overlap with existing regimes which are working well.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
From my point of view, see the word sustainable has been introduced into the bill, and in my view, sustainability would cover environmental and social aspects as well. The extent to which they do that, and coming back to David's point of overlap with CAR, I mean, would need to be teased out. But so you might take a rather light touch on the environmental side, but I think it has to be taken into account if you're looking at sustainable employment of resources.
That's helpful, thank you.
Okay, we can move on to water abstraction now. Alex, you've got some questions on that?
Yeah, she's laughing because it's my favourite subject. You've already touched on the fact that the late addition of abstraction changes meant that you felt that you weren't properly consulted in that. Can I begin by asking what discussions you have had with the Scottish Government on the issue of abstraction?
I'm not aware of any.
None at all.
I think, once the draft bill came out, prior to the draft bill coming out, I don't think there had been any. I think there's been contact since with the lead for the bill. I think it's fair to say we've had a fairly positive response from them that they're happy to discuss these things further. But I don't think we were expecting to. I think it was a bit of a surprise when we saw it on the bill.
Can you therefore outline your concerns about the new abstraction rules that have been proposed?
I think from SSE's point of view, I mean, as I said, there's already planning and there's CAR, so there's already legislation in this area, and I think, and it's also a function of the lack of, the lack of consultation. Is, I think, in responding to the draft bill, we weren't really sure what it was trying to achieve and what the scale of the problem that it was trying to deal with was. We're talking about a handful of applications a year that might be a concern, or are we talking about dozens, or and what those issues might be. So it's difficult to be exact in saying, well, we think CAR already deals with those, or we think planning already deals with those, because we're not quite sure what it's aiming at. But any time you're introducing an entirely new abstraction regime, even with exemptions, on top of existing regulations, you bound to question, is that really necessary to achieve the objective, or are there other ways of doing it? And I think we just haven't had enough information to really form a view on that at the moment.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
From the broader energy sector perspective, there are two big themes in part two. One is all about building and maintaining investor confidence through introducing a reasonable amount of certainty into policy and regulation. And there are a lot of things in part two that are quite open-ended, which we may explore in more detail. The second big theme is implementing the better regulation agenda. Simplifying administrative arrangements, and on the face of it, part two seems to almost double the administrative burden for businesses looking for water abstraction, because once they've gone through the CAR procedure, they also go through the procedure of application to ministers, and this does seem to be quite an additional burden on businesses. And there are costs associated with that as well.
Looking at some of the specifics in your evidence, we note that there is an exemption for hydrogeneration, but you express a fear perhaps that ministers may choose to remove this at some future date. What's your grounds for that fear? Is there any indication that that may happen, or is it simply that the bill leaves that open?
It's simply that the bill leaves that open, and who knows how a different administration in future might want to use those powers. If there is no intention of removing the bill could be worded to say, well, there are these exemptions and ministers can add to those exemptions. But if the bill allows an exemption to be removed, then maybe it's jumping at shadows. But you're always going to feel, well, at some point that adds that uncertainty, as Andy was saying. Businesses are always looking for as much certainty as possible. And if there's no intention to ever remove it, why does the bill allow for it to be removed? And I get, if you're a fish farmer or whoever, you might feel the same. I don't know.
You've suggested that the government should enter into negotiations with you over that as a matter of urgency. I presume by that you mean in order to ensure that we can change the bill before it becomes an act.
I certainly think we'd welcome discussions with the leads on the bill. As I say, just to get some confidence in what the bill's trying to achieve, and then maybe we can be more targeted in our responses about, if we think the current proposals are they necessary? Is the wording appropriate for what you're trying to achieve? If it's not, and it can be tightened up and still achieve the objective, then can we change, as you say, change the wording on the bill before it goes through, so that some of these concerns, if they are groundless, as I think we both would hope they are, then just remove them from the bill.
Yeah, is that a view that's shared across the panel?
Well, certainly, yes. I mean, we look forward to some constructive dialogue on the detail, if that was possible.
Abstractions is not a relevant issue for
You're not required to have a view. Finally, of course, the committee has heard suggestions that there should be a number of exemptions in a number of areas, and you've already touched on issues of exemptions. Do you have any broader views on the issues of exemptions as they have been perhaps raised by other witnesses?
I think the only one the obvious one from an energy point of view would be a cooling water abstractions. Hydro's exempted, but if someone wanted to build like a gas-fired power station or whatever, and that's a major investment, but that would obviously not be caught by, not be included under any of the exemptions, and therefore would be an additional issue for that to be, again, and these are issues which are whether someone can build a new power station is already covered by planning, and so it's not necessary to control it through legislation. It'd be quite unusual to control something like that through abstraction control rather than through planning. So that might be one exemption and you may have others as well, I don't know.
No, that's my favourite exemption as well. Thermal power stations. Yeah.
I think that it's an issue we've touched on with other sections of industry, and we may have further questions to ask others.
And the use of water for cooling is the best environmental option in terms of reducing carbon emissions.
Yes.
So we would support an exemption for thermal power stations as well.
Would you take the general view that's been expressed by some that the upper end limit, over the upper limit, it should be governed in terms of consumption rather than abstraction? That is, if you're taking water out and putting it back immediately in an unharmed way, it shouldn't count as abstraction.
I think there's room for improving terminology and understanding about water use generally in power generation. There are several ways of cooling plants. Some involve once through, so there's no net use of water. Yeah. Some do involve some evaporative cooling, in which case you're consuming some water. I think in terms of valuing water, we're probably moving towards a world where we pay for what we use, rather than paying for rights to abstract.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. If we Move on to Scottish Water's functions. Bob, you've got some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. A theme that seems to be emerging is the issue over the impact that Scottish Water in the commercial market will make. That seems to be the thread that's running through this. So with that in mind, can you expand on the concerns outlined in written evidence about Scottish ministers awarding grant and loans directly to subsidiaries of Scottish Water?
I think it goes back, as you say, it goes back to some of the initial statements we made about open and competitive markets and people competing on fair terms. And I think that's where our concerns, begin and end really. If Scottish Water are able to acquire finance for commercial investments at lower rates than their competitors, then that obviously gives them an advantage. And I think what might be appropriate for public investment in Scottish Water's core functions, may not always be appropriate when it's a subsidiary of Scottish Water investing in a purely commercial venture. And it's just that level playing field that we're looking for. It's not to try and stop Scottish Water developing their assets or gaining that value. It's just to make sure that they do so on the same terms as everybody else.
Yeah, some of our members have been raising some concerns over state aid implications, which, to be honest, I'm not an expert in that, so I wasn't able to alleviate any of their concerns, but it was something I was hoping to put back to the committee on MSPs as to whether it's something that's going to be considered as part of the bill, whether they saw any issues with that as well.
I've got a very simple solution to that, Bob, if you want it.
Perhaps a supplementary later. Mr. Limbrick, Mr. Limbrick, do you have a simple solution to it?
A simple solution, I can imagine what the simple solution is, but I'm not sure how politically that acceptable that would be. But
you have a desirable solution.
I think our concern was to raise the spectre of Brussels intervention and just ensure that the Scottish Government has given due consideration to the state aid rules.
Of course, there's a difference between Brussels intervention and other players within the market seeking Brussels to intervene. Those are two separate things altogether. I'm minded of minimum pricing when I think about that. And I know Mr. Freeland said he wasn't particularly an expert on state aid. Neither am I, but despite that, I'm still going to read out this next question, Mr. Freeland, which I hope you'll have a stab at. Would you think your organisations consider taking action under state aid rules if the provisions in the bill were enacted and the Scottish Government loaned money direct to Scottish Water Horizons to develop renewable energy or waste management infrastructure? So that's a very different thing from, say, Europe wanting to take an interest in it or you guys going to Europe. Those are two very different things. So consideration in relation to that.
I couldn't comment at this stage. I think it needs to be given some very careful consideration at the moment.
Okay. Any other takers on that?
I would say, I think trying to avoid getting into that situation at all. It would obviously be a decision way above my pay grade, but I don't think anybody wants to go there. The costs and the political fallout of that is just no one wants that. But I guess it would depend on how it was implemented and whether people felt they were being severely disadvantaged.
Okay, well, can I commend you on what seems to be a responsible attitude, unlike some aspects that are happening with this committee and elsewhere. So thank you.
And I think you've given us quite a number of questions that we undertake on your behalf to ask the Cabinet Secretary when she comes along to give her evidence and answers to questions raised. Is that it, Bob?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay, Gordon.
Yeah, I've just got a couple of questions about possible distortion of the market. The evidence submitted by the Scottish Environmental Services Association refers to the OEFT investigation into competition between English water companies and waste management companies in the treatment of organic waste. Can you outline the results of this inquiry and explain how they might be of relevance to the proposals in the bill?
Yeah, that was highlighted as an example of some work that's been going on down south at the moment. And I think it was September last year that the OFT published their report. And there were perhaps two main recommendations that came out of that. They noted that when wastewater authorities were competing in the open market with the waste industry, they cited a planning advantage for the wastewater authorities who had existing land banks, existing assets to use and utilise. And I think the second important thing they noticed, that they noted, was that the economic framework provided another advantage to the wastewater authorities over the waste industry. So I thought it was quite important to flag these 2 points up for consideration within the bill.
And also you indicated in the evidence that Scottish Water and its subsidiaries are able to offer organic waste collection service below the market rate. Can you provide any examples of this happening in practice and explain how Scottish Water is able to undercut commercial rivals?
I think that would probably centre on the fact that they have full access to not only provision for anaerobic digestion plants, but they also have, for example, access to the existing sewer network. And if there was a situation arising, for example, where Scottish Water and another company were bidding for a contract from a producer of organic waste, by having the backup of being able to utilise the sewer network for certain wastes that might not be able to be utilised all the time within our anaerobic digestion plants, they are then able to make a more competitive bid for a contract from to get the waste from a producer. And because the waste management industry doesn't have that same access to the sewer network, they would need to, as part of their bid, they would need to ensure that if they wanted to use a sewer network for any reason, that they would then have to use that sewer network at a spot price rather than building it into the overall contracts that they're able to offer.
Is that not just making efficient use of the sewer network then?
If, for example, if the Scottish Water and the waste management company were able to use the sewer network at the same rate, then that would have been fine.
Okay, and finally, you raised concerns that Business Stream's dominant market position gives it an almost monopoly status to introduce new organic waste services. Can you expand on this comment and explain what impact this may have on commercial waste service providers?
I think that's just from when the Business Stream was set up as a branch from Scottish Water, that all the customers pretty much by default went to that subsidiary, which makes it very hard for anyone who wanting to be a new entrant into the market to get into that.
But new folk are coming into the market, and new folk are taking customers from Business Stream. So, I mean, that's just a question of time, isn't it? That there will be new entrants and there will be other competitors.
Yes, maybe over time that might happen, but it's obviously on the outset it is quite difficult.
Okay. You haven't given us any written evidence on parts 4, 5, 6 and 7 of the bill, but are there any comments you would like to make on any other proposals in the bill at all? Nope.
I think we covered
okay,
everything.
Anybody else got any further questions? No? Okay, can I thank you very much for attending today and giving us your evidence. Thank you very much. And if we could get the follow-up of some of the written stuff that you promised, that'd be grand. Thank you very much. Just a brief suspension to allow the witnesses to leave the room. Okay, move on to agenda item 3 finally. Subordinate legislation. The committee is now invited to consider an instrument of subordinate legislation subject to the negative procedure, namely the Green Deal Acknowledgement Scotland Regulations 2012. Can I refer members to paper 5 on the accompanying instrument? Members should note that no motions to annul have been received in relation to this instrument. Does anyone have any comments? No. Can I ask whether the committee has agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendation in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. That ends our business for today. At our next meeting on October the 24th, we'll continue consideration of the Water Resources Bill and we'll appoint our new EU reporter. Can I now close the meeting? Thank you.